The average menstrual cycle is about 29 days. As we move into that 10 years before menopause, the average cycle length can start creeping up closer to 26 days. So what that means...
Welcome to Wellness, your ultimate guide to unlocking your full human potential through biohacking. I'm your host, Ashley Daly. I'm a certified sports nutrition coach, and I have a degree in kinesiology, and I'm a former personal trainer and Pilates instructor. If you're listening on YouTube, hit subscribe, as it helps listeners just like you find this hidden health information faster. Today's guest is Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner and mom of 3. She specializes in training women's health practitioners to interpret the menstrual cycle as a vital sign for optimal health. Lisa is the author of the best-selling book, The Fifth Vital Sign, and she co-authored Real Food for Fertility with Lily Nichols, RDN. Her work directly challenges the misconception that regular ovulation is solely relevant for conception. Instead, she champions the menstrual cycle's broader utility as a critical indicator of psychological well-being. Drawing extensively from current scientific literature, she presents an evidence-based framework for women to understand their reproductive health comprehensively. Lisa has over 2 decades of teaching experience, and she educates on the intricate connections among the menstrual cycle, fertility, and systemic health. Her podcast, Fertility Friday, serves as a leading global resource for information on fertility awareness and menstrual cycle physiology. Her mission is to equip every woman with a deep understanding of her own body, transforming this knowledge into a powerful tool for optimal health. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you here, and I'm such a fan of your show. I feel like fangirl. I get so excited when people say yes to be on my show. So where I want to start is, what is fertility awareness?
Well, that is a great question and a great place to start. I think because I've been in the field for so long, I could answer this question in lots of different ways. I feel like in the general sense, if you just think of the words fertility awareness, it would mean to have a general understanding of your cycle, to have an understanding of how to tell when you're ovulating, if you've ovulated, and to know when your period is coming. So I think in the general sense, it would be, okay, you understand what, the role of cervical mucus in general, even just when you have it is you're in your fertile window, that kind of thing. You kind of understand generally the role of temperature, where if you're taking your temperature when it goes up, that means ovulation has taken place. So, that's a general way to look at it. And I would say in a more specific way, if you want to take it to all the way down the rabbit hole, right, into my department, my area of expertise, you could learn a specific fertility awareness based method and then use that information for a specific outcome. So you can really dive into cycle charting and, pay attention to all the details so that you can identify your fertile window, use that as a birth control method. And, the symptothermal method, which combines the temperature with the mucus and also uses a last infertile day calculation. That specific method has been shown to have up to a 99.4% efficacy rate, which puts it on par with hormonal birth control when used correctly. So if you want to go all the way down the rabbit hole, be a data nerd like myself, you can actually use it for that purpose. Or if you're trying to conceive, you can get really dialed into which days are fertile, which days are not, to really optimize your chances of conception.
Oh, thank you. I love the part that you mentioned about details. And I'm going to share a personal story, which I'm sure you've heard hundreds of times, but I was on birth control for years. And when I decided to get off, I was really interested in, and Lisa, I hate this word, cervical mucus. I'm like, can we call it feminine serum or something?
That is the first time I ever heard that. That's hilarious, feminine serum.
But I hate the word, but I started to experience different variations of it. And I was like, what? And I was like, I should learn more about my body. So can you dive into what are these vital signs? What can we do to measure what we want to take stock of in our bodies?
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And I'll take a moment to it's interesting. I've just been in the field too long, so I'm over all of it, right? So the word cervical mucus doesn't bother me at all. And so but I totally understand because a lot of people are like mucus, like so from like a scientific standpoint, it's like you know how you have mucous membranes in your nose. Fun fact: if you have allergies and you take antihistamines to dry up the runny nose, it dries up your runny mucus. Like it is actually like mucus membrane. So if that helps you to kind of like fine, it's a scientific term, like great. But obviously you can also interchange with cervical fluid. And, you know, I have a colleague, Nora Pope, who refers to it as white flow. You know, so there's different ways to whatever you're comfortable with. But what you shared is interesting. I'm sure you're not the only one. I mean, when you're on the pill, one of the ways that the pill prevents pregnancy is by shutting down your fertile quality mucus production. So when you're on the pill, you wouldn't observe any significant fertile quality mucus. And fertile quality mucus is like that creamy white hand lotion or that clear, stretchy, like raw egg white consistency. You know, you start cycling again and you're like, what is going on in my underwear?
Yes.
Why is this happening? And although I can't relate, I did take the pill. I took it for a shorter period of time, but I do distinctly remember around that time when I had my first period, starting to all of a sudden have this stuff in my underwear. And, you know, I asked my mom about it. She was just like, well, she just gave me a box of panty liners. Like she didn't know what it was either, but she's kind of like, oh, yeah, that stuff. Yeah, I just wear these. So I can relate to that. So getting back to your question about how can we start understanding what's happening in our body, if you're not currently taking a hormonal birth control method and you're actually cycling normally, I mean, anyone who is cycling normally, you probably like you've experienced it likely, but unless someone tells you what it is, you just wouldn't necessarily be aware. It was just like there's just some days in the month where I feel really wet and I don't know why. There's some days in the month where I actually think maybe my period started. I go to the bathroom, no period. Like, what is that? But you don't think about it, right? Because no one's bringing it to light. So when you are in that phase of your cycle, so let's say you have your period and your period is ended, you are in your pre-ovulatory phase. And so your body, as your body's preparing to release an egg, your follicle is developing. And as that follicle is developing, it's producing estrogen. And as that estrogen level rises, that is what actually stimulates your cervix to make this cervical fluid. And that is what you notice. So you may experience it as, let's say you're literally walking around throughout the day and you actually just feel really wet down there. You may experience it as, and like your underwear is a little bit wet, but it's not sweat. You may experience it as you go to the bathroom and you're wiping, and then some days of the cycle you wipe and it's really slippery. I joke like your hand hits the back of the toilet kind of situation, or you just have to wipe multiple times because it just feels really slippery, almost like you have lube down there because it's actually kind of similar to lube. And so if you're actually, you know, into this and checking, you know, some women would be checking it internally. Some women would be pulling it off their underwear and kind of like testing it to see if it stretches. And some women might be using the wiping method where you wipe intentionally like before and after you go to the bathroom and actually check that toilet paper to see what you're seeing. So just from a general standpoint, without following any specific methods, just being aware of that shift and starting to pay attention in whatever way that makes sense to you right now is really helpful. And the important takeaway is that when you have that cervical fluid, when you start to see those observations, so your period has stopped and you start to see that, those are your fertile days. So if you're trying to get pregnant, you would want to base it on that. When you're slippery down there, when you've got all this wet stuff in your underwear, when you're like, whew, like you're trying to wipe and it's like, whew, those are the days. And it doesn't matter if it's not day 15 or day 14 or whatever. If it's day 5, if it's day 20, you just base it on that first. So that would be a good place to start for understanding. And then, I mean, you know, the other really common sign that a lot of women track would be their temperature. And so basically you would take your temperature each morning before you get out of bed. Now, the temperature does not tell you your fertile days. It doesn't tell you when you're ovulating. It rises after ovulation. So I mentioned that your body's preparing for pregnancy in that first half, or not pregnancy, your body's preparing for ovulation, pardon me, in that first half of the cycle. And as that follicle develops, it's making that estrogen, and the estrogen is what's triggering those changes in the cervical fluid. And then once you ovulate, that follicle bursts open, the egg is released, and then it turns into the corpus luteum, which is a temporary endocrine gland that makes progesterone. So the second half of the cycle is where we make progesterone. Progesterone typically shuts down that mucus production. So we go from having all of this like wet, lovely, slippery stuff to then not having it typically. So it dries up significantly. And then also that progesterone causes us to have an increase in our body temperature. And that's what the temperature is measuring. So once that temperature rises, if you're tracking it, if you're putting it in your app and all that kind of stuff, then you can look back and say, oh, it looks like I ovulated. So it's a retrospective measure. You can also pay attention to changes in your cervical position. So for those of us who are ambitious and really keen and we want to check our cervix, so you would take your clean finger, insert it into your vagina, and then check your cervical position. And again, it's all of this is really fascinating. I remember when I first started charting in my late teens, and I read all of the stuff in the book and then I started doing it. And so it was really cool because around ovulation, your cervix tends to be softer and open. So if you were to put your lips together and put your finger to your lip, you kind of feel a bit of an indent. And so that is what it means when it's open. So if you've never had a baby come through your cervix, it kind of feels like an indent. If you have had a baby come through your cervix, it will actually be slightly dilated. And then once you've ovulated, it changes quite a bit. So typically more firm. That opening is not there as much. Or if you have had a baby, it's just firmer, because I've had 3 come out of there. So now my cervix is always a little bit open, but I can still very distinctly tell the difference between like during the fertile window and after. So, to wrap it all up, like it's really interesting. It's really cool for anyone who's hearing about this for the first time. What's really cool about it is that these are reliable signs that are cyclical. So it's not like this happens once. This is just what your body is doing. You might not have known about this. You didn't pay attention to it, but this is what's going on all the time. And so when you start to learn about the fertility awareness method and you start to learn about, how to track your cycle and these different signs, now you're just like hip to the party that has already been happening in your underwear. And and so now you can actually just pay attention to what your body was already doing all along.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. There is so much that I want to unpack here. Starting with, I just want to circle back on what you said about histamine. I feel like that's so important, and that if you want to take charge of your health and you want to make things work down there, maybe don't take antihistamines. But what I want to go back to is maybe take a step back and start from the very beginning, because you also said charting. And when I was starting to learn about my body, I felt like I was wearing like the veil over my face for so long. I can't believe I didn't know anything about my body. But can you walk us through what is day one? What is charting?
Yes, absolutely. Like we are just jumping in. So I'm going hard wherever we are. But that's a really good point, because I mean, it is a long conversation, right? Like the first time you're learning this information, there's a lot to it. And so if we go back to just like, what is the first day of your cycle? What does a normal cycle look like? What are we even talking about here? What is charting? So, I mean, the first day of your cycle is actually the first day of your period, the first day where you have flow. And so while it's not uncommon for women to maybe have a day or two of light spotting or something like that before their period comes on, for anyone who has had a period, when it has arrived, right? So it's when that real flow, true flow starts. So that would be day one. And so, we kind of walked through the cycle a little bit, but if we think about what is normal for a period, I think that it's really useful to define these things. What I found is that for most of us, we've only really experienced our own cycles and we don't necessarily talk about it. I don't know if it's different now, but when I was growing up, as much as my girlfriends, we thought we talked about everything, we didn't really talk about our periods in any type of detail beyond I had it or I have it. You never really talked about like who's talking about how many pads you use today, who's talking about how full your pads were, right? So we don't really know what our girlfriends are doing. And so I think that's why it's helpful to know the normal parameters. So anyway, so a period, typically on average about 5 days or so, and should be somewhere between 3 to 7. And I always say a period should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it should be over like a sentence. And so we shouldn't expect that it just kind of tapers off and you have like 10 days of on and off bleeding or spotting or anything like that. Typically starts like moderate and then kind of gets to heavy and then gradually tapers off. So typically that's what we would expect. And also, although it's really common for women to have a lot of pain with menstruation, I would argue that moderate to severe pain, even though it's common, sure, it's definitely common, it's not optimal. And we want to understand that it is a sign of inflammation. So one of the research studies that I cited in my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, it looked at the prostaglandin levels of women with period pain versus women without. And prostaglandins are a marker of inflammation. And so the women who had period pain had upwards of 4 times higher levels of these prostaglandins compared to the women who didn't have pain. So I think as much data and information as I can have about pain, I try to share, because then it gives more credence to, oh, wait a minute. So if I have pain, I'm actually different to people who don't have pain, which would indicate that there's something I could potentially do to reduce the pain, right? So this is the whole thing around that. And then in terms of the volume, the period volume, how much you bleed. So, the average period volume, somewhere around 45 to 50 milliliters. So I know I'm Canadian in metric. And the upper end, according to a lot of different researchers, is probably 80 milliliters. So somewhere between 1 to 3 ounces for the Americans, which is interesting because a lot of women do bleed more than that. The reason that they would say up to 80 mils is because when you bleed more than that, you may be more likely to be deficient in iron because you're losing so much blood. And also when you bleed more than that, there might be a reason for it. You might have fibroids or polyps, or there might be something that you want to be screened for. So having that upper limit also should serve as a guide, where if you're wearing a cup, if you use a menstrual cup and you're filling it every 2 hours, and this is your norm, then even if your practitioner wasn't really taking you seriously, like, you have to kind of be very specific. I fill a pad every hour. You have to tell them that kind of detail, and then encourage screening. So I could go on a whole tangent, but that's just what's normal for periods. And so if we go back to the cycle, so after you've started your period, then we are in that pre-ovulatory phase. We talked a little bit about how during that phase, your body's preparing for ovulation, and you're making mucus as you approach ovulation. And the mucus is really interesting. I went back to saying the word mucus. So, but I think you're probably a little bit better with it right now.
I think so.
I'm hoping a little. But so that cervical fluid that you're making as you approach ovulation, it keeps the sperm alive for up to 5 days. So there's this really cool design. Our bodies are made in such a way that you're making this mucus before you ovulate. And if you were trying to get pregnant and you have sex on those days, then the sperm actually kind of lives and survives and hangs out in your cervix waiting for the time for ovulation. So understanding that is really helpful as well, because before I learned fertility awareness, it was all a mystery. They just told us we were fertile every day, and there was no safe days, and you could get pregnant all the time. And so you're just like, 16 and just terrified. Like, this is kind of stuff that can wake you up in the middle of the night, keep you up all night, just fertile all the time, like just all the time. And so no, there's a window. And it's, from a scientific standpoint, it's 6 days. So because the sperm can live for up to 5 days, it's the 5 days leading up to ovulation plus ovulation day. And then if we're using it as a method, we have to put a little, barrier around that, some additional days. So there's rules around how to deal with that if you're actually using it as a birth control method. But so that is the first half of your cycle. Now, once you've ovulated, then we talked about how you make progesterone, and that shuts down the mucus production. If in a healthy cycle typically falls somewhere between about 24 to 35 days in length, with an average of about 29 days. So in order for your cycle to be healthy, in order to actually get into that range, you would, expect ovulation to happen somewhere between days 10 and 22 on the later end, just so that your cycle would actually fall within that 35-day range. And then once you've ovulated, the second half of your cycle, the post-ovulatory phase, it's also called the luteal phase. So that typically in a healthy cycle is going to last at least 12 to 14 days. By going through all that information, I know it's a lot of information, but what that does is it gives you a general sense of like what a normal period should look like. Like, there's more details I could go into, but that gives you just an overall sense of, okay, so there's a little bit of a range here. This is what to expect in the first half. This is what to expect in the second half. And then if you're listening and you're like, well, wait a minute, my periods are like 50 days or my cycles are 50 days, I should say. I go 50 days between periods or whatever. Then you already know that that's way outside the range. And so there's a reason for that. Or if you know that you don't just bleed during your period, you have your period, but then you bleed multiple times or you have spotting for several days throughout your cycle, you already know because that's outside of the normal range. So it's pretty empowering to have this information so that at least you know when you're outside of that.
Yes.
And then you can kind of try to figure out what to do about it, which isn't always easy to get your practitioners to take you seriously. That's like a huge problem. But at least having that information gives you that starting point.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that and for saying the word empowering, because I feel like I was just on birth control because I didn't want to get pregnant, because I was told it only takes one time. Doesn't matter. It just takes one time. So, Lisa, you went through a lot, and I want to back up and go through some of these one by one. So you said the word normal. Can you give us an idea of what a normal cycle should look like?
Well, yeah. I mean, just to kind of summarize, so like the short version is, average length of about 29 days with the range being between 24 and 35. Period at the beginning of that cycle, average of about 5 days. The range would be about 3 to 7. So, in terms of, in order for your cycle to fall within that range, we would expect ovulation, average is around day 15. But in order to have a cycle within that range, ovulation has to happen somewhere between days 10 and 22-ish. So obviously 22-ish is a little bit on the longer end, but 35 days is the longer end. So that puts that into perspective. And then in terms of cervical fluid, we've spoken about it, 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid, average, 5 days or so leading up to ovulation, with at least one day where you see that clear, stretchy fluid. Like if you were to actually pick it up off the toilet paper or your underwear or something, it kind of stretches like the raw egg white consistency. And then the second half of your cycle after ovulation, we would be looking at 12 to 14 days in length. So if you're ovulating and you're tracking your cycle and, your period's coming like a week later or 8 days later or whatever, 10 days later, that would mean your luteal phase is on the shorter side. And if your luteal phase is on the shorter side, you're not getting as many days of progesterone. If you're making progesterone during that, 12 to 14 day period, like 12 to 14 day phase, second half of your cycle, then you're getting 12 to 14 days of progesterone, right? But if you're getting your period already 7 days after you ovulated, you're missing out 5 whole days of progesterone. So by definition, your progesterone would be low, given that you don't have the exposure for as long. And then also you could still have a 12-day luteal with suboptimal progesterone. So those are the parameters of a normal cycle in a nutshell.
Now, when I told my community that I was interviewing you, I received so many questions. It was like endless DMs. So I have a few pieces of paper of them. I don't know if we'll get to all of them today, but one of them was around that cervical mucus where we started, which was, if I get it just a couple days before my period, is that normal?
I feel like sometimes I don't even love the word normal because it's common. I think, and interestingly, in my practitioner program, that is the post-ovulatory return of cervical mucus is like a whole situation. We've created multiple trainings on it, multiple handouts and checklists, because obviously when you learn about charting and you read the really cool books on the menstrual cycle, none of them say like, and you can expect to get mucus after you, like, right? None of them say that. So there's different reasons why a person might be observing mucus after ovulation. And, one of the things I always talk about is like, everybody isn't learning the same way to chart. So everybody isn't checking their mucus in the same way. So for example, if someone's checking internally, like they're inserting their finger into their vagina and that's how they're checking for mucus, I mean, unless you've been trained in a certain way, your vagina is never dry. It's always going to be moist. And there's always going to be something on your finger when you put it in there. So some women are, concerned about mucus observations, but some of what they're seeing might not actually be mucus. It could be vaginal cell slough or whatever, like if they're checking in a certain way. So the first thing I'll say is, if I was working with a client, I wouldn't just take their first chart as gospel. I would find out how they're checking and get us on the same page so that we're really checking in a way where I can be sure like what you're seeing is actually mucus and not just, cell stuff or whatever. So that's the first thing. It might not even be mucus, but whatever. So the second thing is, okay, we're sorted out the method. We know how you're charting and you're actually seeing mucus. And it, just for the record, it is possible to see mucus post-op. It happens, obviously. your community member wouldn't be asking the question if she didn't see something, right? So that's even a myth. I think that sometimes because we have learned about what is kind of optimal, right, then we are really confused when something happens that is not there. So anyway, so there's a lot of different reasons why you might see mucus, actual mucus after ovulation. Now, sometimes we see mucus like right after ovulation, meaning you had your approach to ovulation, you're seeing cervical fluid as you approach ovulation, and then you ovulate, but your temperature goes up, but you still continue to see mucus for a few days. So I feel like that is really common as well, and kind of self-explanatory if you think about it. I mean, progesterone is what shuts down the mucus production. Not everybody has optimal hormone production. There's a lot of different factors. A lot of us know that we're not getting enough sleep. A lot of us work out a lot. We don't necessarily eat more on those exercise days. A lot of us drink coffee multiple times a day, and and that suppresses our appetite, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of reasons why we may not be having optimal hormones production. And so if your progesterone production is taking a little bit of time to really ramp up, then you might see something like that. Or if you have a stressful situation or something like that, mid-luteal, sometimes if you're charting, you might even notice this weird, like random temperature drop in the middle of your luteal and it kind of goes back up. And that sometimes is associated with mucus as well, because it shows, because when you're still making a lot of estrogen post-op. So when we talk about the hormones, it's not like you ovulate and then you stop making progesterone, it's not like you ovulate and stop making estrogen for the rest of the cycle and it's only progesterone that you're making. You're actually making a significant amount of estrogen post-op. It's just a little, like it's less than what you were in that window, like when it was super high, but it's still significant. And so if your progesterone is kind of like fluctuating, then you might see mucus based on hormonal fluctuation. And the other thing is, if the question was around seeing it like right before your period. So there's all, like I could ask 100 questions right now, but as you're approaching your period, naturally speaking, your progesterone level would be, we would expect it to be highest mid-luteal. So if I'm defining a normal luteal phase as 12 to 14 days, mid-luteal is probably about 7 days after ovulation. So if you're on day 12 or day 10 or day 11, we would already expect that your progesterone is tapering off a little bit, and maybe it's not optimal. Maybe it's tapering off a lot, and that could correlate with the mucus. So I could go on, but I feel like that is probably a lot.
Okay.
And that probably really helped for the
Yes.
wonderful woman who asked that question.
I think so. Thank you. The next one that I really wanted to ask you, and I feel like you touched on the iceberg of it, but someone else in my community said that when she's on day 2, she can't leave the house. She's just on the toilet all day long. And you had mentioned iron, maybe getting checked for polyps. What else can we do if we have really heavy periods?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly concerning. I would definitely encourage her to quantify it. So however she's, what are you using to collect your bleeding, right? If you're using pads or tampons or like both, then write down how many you're going through. So for one cycle, if you're tracking your cycle already, actually track, today I used 6 pads and they were all full. So also quantify how many, but also like, were they all full? And what size? Was it a super? Was it a regular? Whatever, right? And if you're using a cup, same idea. Like how many times did you fill? It doesn't have to be perfect science, but you need to have a general understanding. You should be able to give me a report. And from that, I should be able to gauge how, have a good understanding of how much you're bleeding. So, for me, there's a lot of questions I would want to know. I would want to know if it was like, was it always like this? If this is new, when did it start? When was the last time it wasn't like this? And how, like, if you can think about a specific time, because sometimes when you ask questions of like this to your clients, it's like, okay, so when was the last time it was normal? Oh, it was before we moved, or oh, it was before my whatever. Sometimes it's something really significant, like, oh, it was before my dad died or something, right? So like maybe not, but either way, it's worth asking. And that just, even sometimes those kinds of questions can make you self-reflect, like, oh, that was before I started this new job and I needed to travel 2 hours a day back, like, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh. So that, in the general sense, and you want to collect that data so that you can go to your practitioner, because it's hard to get your practitioners to take you seriously. Is it just me? Okay. So if you're just like, yeah, my period's heavy, then it's like, yeah, go on the pill. But if you go in there with a report, okay, I've tracked my last 3-5 periods, and this is how long they've lasted. This one lasted for 7 days, and I bled. I went through like 10 pads per day. I was filling 1 pad an hour for the first 2 days, and these were super pads. And you can go on the internet and get an estimate for how much blood that is, right? Chat GPT it. And then you can say, based on my calculations, that is X, milliliters or X ounces, for the each period. So that would be something where if you actually approach it like that with data, you're much more likely to have your practitioner say, oh, okay, I didn't realize. And you have to talk their language to get assistance. So, there's always different reasons why this could be happening. And if it was me, I'd want to know like the whole picture. How long is your cycle? Because if your cycles are 50 days, so in a 50-day cycle, you're not ovulating multiple times. That's a myth. You would be ovulating once if you ovulated, like if it's in fact ovulatory. And if we're talking a 50-day cycle and the luteal phase it's never like 30 days. So the luteal phase, typically there's a maximum of maybe 15, 16, like that's possible. And so if you think about a 50-day cycle, that likely, let's just say hypothetically, you ovulated then on day 38 and had a 12-day luteal phase, right? So that's 38 days of estrogen exposure in this example and 12 days of progesterone. So women who have this really imbalanced situation where they have like 38 days of estrogen exposure compared to progesterone are more likely to have heavy bleeding. So there could be something like that happening where you have a lot of estrogen exposure. And of course, it could be something like fibroids or polyps or, whatever the case is. Or if it could even be something like a bleeding disorder where you need to have, go to a hematologist and they need to do some testing to make sure you have the clotting factor. So either way, like start by tracking more specifically and talk their language, and then push for testing. And if you're not being taken seriously, then find someone else and continue until they take you seriously.
Amazing. That's really helpful. I feel like that was so much deeper than I thought the answer could be. So thank you. Okay. You had also mentioned pain, and I got a lot of questions about pain. So one of them was, this woman was backpacking and in elevation about 5 miles. She had 30 pounds on her back. And the next day she started her period, and she said her cramps were so intense that she thought she needed to be airlifted out of where she had hiked into. And she wanted to know, because the cramps, she said, felt like contractions. And so she was curious, are cramps contractions, and what can she do about pain?
Oh, there's so much in that question. We'll start with the question, are cramps contractions? So I've experienced really bad cramps. That was one of my, I would say I experienced primary dysmenorrhea. That's the word for when you had cramps, pain from your first period. And I remember when I was in my late teens, I think, having this conversation with my male cousin. And I was telling him, I'm like, it's like I'm in labor, but there's no baby. And he was like, that's impossible. It couldn't be that, because he knows, right? That's impossible. It couldn't be like that. So I have had 3 children, and they were all delivered vaginally in my house. We had them at home, no epidural. And so my conclusion is they're very similar. I would say that, so I'm going to answer this in 2 different ways. So the first, I'm going to answer from a personal perspective, but I would say that while contractions are different, and I experienced labor differently those 3 times, the I found the contractions from labor in some ways to be easier to deal with in some ways, okay? Not all the ways. The reason I would say that is because contractions with labor, first of all, you're having a baby. So at least they're happening for a reason. So you can logically understand why you're dealing with it, right?
Yes.
Whereas period, like you don't get anything out of the deal. Like you're just in pain. So that was one thing. The other thing was that the contractions, they come and go. So like when you're in labor, you get the contraction and then it like peels back and you often get a little bit of a break, even though as you get further on into labor, like you get less and less of a break, but you do get an actual break. So in some ways, I found those earlier contractions in the earlier parts of labor to be easier to deal with than period pain. Okay.
Wow.
So the second, yes. And to funny story, I've got lots of funny stories, but funny story, when I went into labor with my son, because my eldest son, my first child, I had never had a baby before. So I didn't know I was in labor all day because I was like, oh, I can't be in labor. My period pain's worse than this. All day. I was in labor. Because they only came every 20 minutes. I was like, is it a Braxton Hicks? I was like, right. And then eventually I knew. Eventually, you know. But yeah, all day. I was like, it can't be labor. Okay. So for anyone who's like, no, it's not the same. Like, just, can it? So the other thing was that there was this one day that I was reading this research paper, and I mean, I just got so mad. I like came upstairs and I was like venting to my husband. So I'm reading this paper and it actually quantified the strength, I guess you could say, of contractions. And so if I'm remembering this correctly, what it said was that when a woman is in labor and she's having like good, strong contractions, they are measuring at, I'm trying to think of the best word, but I like strength came to mind, but maybe like the force of them. They have a unit that they call, it's like millimeters of mercury. So any midwives listening, you're like, yeah, they know. So they said a woman who has good, strong labor contractions measures somewhere like 90 millimeters of mercury. And then they said that when women have like intense period pain, what do you guess?
So it was 9 before?
90.
90. 125?
400.
Oh.
Yeah. And then the researchers had the nerve to be like, so maybe sometimes when women say that their period pain is equivalent or worse to labor, maybe there's something to that. And I was just like,
Oh, you think?
Like those cartoon characters where they go red. Just, so yeah, so that, and again, I will always opt to share these kinds of stats and information because that validates it. How many women have had this type of pain for so long and they're not listened to? They're kind of gaslighted. They're kind of told that it's in their head, like it couldn't be that bad. Like literally the example with my cousin, like, yeah, it couldn't be. But according to their measurements, the pain of, severe periods, the cramps were way worse. And I'm not, again, I have delivered 3 children from my vagina. So I am in no way saying that that's a picnic or whatever. Like labor gets real and eventually that crowning, no, period pain does not compare to the crowning. Okay. But at the same time, I mean, it's severe enough that it is comparable to some aspects of labor. And so we really need to understand that.
Well, thank you for sharing those stories and that insight. So cramps are not contractions, but they can feel like it is what it sounds like.
I feel like they're similar, but
okay.
I would, as someone who has experienced really severe period pain, there are times that you feel it contracting. So I used to, so TMI, trigger warning. I fortunately don't have this symptom, anymore. But in my early years when I would have period cramps, it would feel like someone was reaching into my bum and squeezing really hard. Like, now, I mean, we can laugh or whatever. I'm saying this because I've also, like, I've heard women describe their pain in so many different ways and
Oh.
this is what I'm saying is not out unusual for someone who's experienced period pain. I suspect that I might have a touch of endometriosis. I have not done a laparoscopic procedure, nor do I plan to. And I have over the years managed to find specific strategies to really eliminate that. So most periods now, for the record, I'm at a 0.5 out of 10, or something like along those lines, where it's just, you have your period, but there's no pain. So I share that also to know that it's possible. But in that instance, I share that because anyone who's experienced severe pain, it's like my personal experience of pain was different to contractions. Because like I said, my experience of contractions is that they would wax and wane. So there would be a space in between them. But my experience of period pain is that they would wax and wane, but it wouldn't go away. So like you would get like the intense, like horrible cramp, and it would ease up a bit, but it would never go away. So you were still in pain all the time, but it would just get worse sometimes.
What can we do about period pain?
What I found over the years working with, different clients of varying levels of pain and different situations is that, some women have period pain and it's likely related to inflammation and just a little bit more manageable things. And some women have pain and it likely is a deeper sign of endometriosis. So in my work, and I don't work only or specifically with women with period pain. So I think it would be different for somebody who specifically has endo on their, door. They would probably get just a lot more women with really severe pain. So generally speaking, a lot of the women I worked with would be able to either have a really significant improvement in their pain or completely eliminate it. But there was always a small percentage who a lot of what we did wouldn't touch. And those would be the really severe cases that we would think possibly could be related to endo. So in a general sense, I would say you want to start to learn about what affects your pain and what causes it. And so understanding the role that inflammation plays and start to look at what you're eating. And that's a tough conversation, because that's a whole situation. But when you learn a little bit more about diet and nutrition, learn about how our, conventional meat is processed, learn the difference between the general, not to say I'm not putting down meat. I think meat is a really great source of nutrition, but understanding the difference between, the grass-fed animals versus the corn-fed, the soy-fed, because there is a big difference in the inflammatory output of the meat when cows are designed to eat grass.
Yes.
And so there are studies that have there's researchers that have studied this. And so there are papers, again, that I cited in the Fifth Vital Sign and in Real Food for Fertility, where they're actually looking at the quality of meat from grass-fed versus grain-fed. And they can, you can see that there's a higher inflammatory composition to the meat. And also dairy. So I'm a big proponent of dairy, but we want to understand the quality that can differ. And so similarly, those cows that are fed the corn and soy, likely that milk is also going to be more inflammatory. So starting to understand a little bit about food quality, it's not about being perfect or anything like that. It's just starting to understand the potential sources of inflammation. Even the type of milk. So there are women who report that if they switch to sheep or goat's milk, which is typically, there's a different kind of milk. There's a protein, A2 or A1, beta casein. It's a whole situation. But if you learn a little bit about the different kinds of milk and the protein, some women find that if they switch to like sheep's milk or goat's milk or A2 cow's milk, that they experience a significant improvement in their pain just by switching the type of dairy because of that protein. The A1 protein is associated with higher rates of inflammation and a whole host of other issues. And it's very strange when you read it, when you think this one protein. And because a lot of people would say it's milk. Milk is inflammatory. Milk is the problem. But when you actually dig into it, there's, different levels of quality and processing and all of these things. So even looking at your diet overall, looking at the macronutrient ratio and looking at the quality of the carbohydrates that you're consuming. If you're eating a lot of processed foods, if you're eating a lot of high sugar foods or a lot of grains, those foods are inflammatory as well. So it can be a bit of a challenge because with period pain, if it's moderate to severe, we want to have a solution. We want to listen to the girl on the podcast who says, take magnesium. And then, and for some women, they can start taking magnesium and then their periods are amazing. But it really depends on the level of what's happening in your body. And for some women, it's, however many years of intense period pain that they've had, it's going to take several months for them to really start addressing the inflammation and really starting to kind of figure out what works and looking at the right, supplement situation to complement the different changes that you're making, incorporating movement, maybe a little bit lighter than the 30 pounds on the right, but finding the right degree of movement for your body, resting. There's a lot of different factors that play into this. And then also if the pain is so severe that nothing does anything, even Advil and other NSAIDs don't do anything, then it's time to start looking into potentially, testing. It's hard because for endometriosis diagnosis, and endometriosis is a condition where you're having endometrial-like tissue that's growing outside of the uterus. So there's an immune dysregulation situation there. There's a lot of inflammation. And depending on where this tissue is growing, it can be associated with significant pain and infertility. In some cases, not everybody who has endometriosis has pain. It depends on where it's growing. But if something like that is suspected, the gold standard for diagnosis is a laparoscopic procedure. So it's not as easy as just getting a blood test or something like that. Even if you get an MRI or an ultrasound, that doesn't even guarantee the diagnosis. But if you start to learn a little bit more about it, if you start to learn about the symptoms, if you start to educate yourself about what's happening, then you're in a much better situation to start advocating for yourself, advocating for testing. According to the research, on average, it takes anywhere from 8 to 12 years from the onset of painful symptoms for a woman to actually get a diagnosis of endometriosis from her doctor. Oh. So know what you're up against. This is why I went into all this detail about the pain. This is why I shared all those that information about, the prostaglandin levels. So, wait a minute, there's inflammatory markers that are higher in women who have pain. Wait a minute, these researchers found that women who had extreme pain had significantly more pressure in terms of their contractions. We can call them contractions for now, but those cramps were significantly, more, they were stronger. So when we have this information and that it could take more than one practitioner, hopefully that gives you a little bit of courage and, I guess, permission to keep asking. I think sometimes we just get discouraged. You are so sure that there's something wrong and you go to that one doctor and they're just like, no, it's fine. No, you're good. You're too young to have, all that nonsense, right, that they say. And so I think sometimes we just need to have someone in our corner who's like, you know what, just that's how it is. Unfortunately, our medical system, they're not really trained in this way. So even if it's hard because I'm older. So I've been in this field for a long time. So I feel like I've already gotten a lot of the why is it that way? All that stuff out. So I just look at it like it's not really even their fault. They're just not really trained. So if you can get to the point where you're not so emotionally upset when you don't get the help you need, because you should be, but it's not productive, right? If the goal is to get help, right? You want to be helped. You want whatever it is to be identified. You want to have someone take you seriously. So if it doesn't happen the first time, that's normal. 8 to 12 years was the average in this study. And that means some of these women had this pain for 20 years before they ever had a diagnosis. So you're not alone. You're in good company. And so in order to get what you need to be persistent, and you need to understand the situation, the limitations of our current system. And then you have to be really savvy and you have to have a lot of grit to actually get it done.
Yes. We need someone like Lisa in our corner. Well, since you mentioned being older, I feel like this is a good segue because many of my listeners, including myself, are in perimenopause and on that perimenopause journey. And another question I received was, I was told my cramps were going to get worse into perimenopause as I age. Is that true?
That's just, I love the things that we're told, right? By the way, expect it to get worse. You won't even be able to get out of bed. You're just, thanks. Have a nice one. Merry Christmas. Anyways, so, um, yeah, I mean, that's highly problematic. I think that the level of pain that you experience is so painful periods aren't related to age. So some women are going to find that they get worse. Some women do find that their periods get worse, air quotes. It's not uncommon for women in that perimenopause stage to start experiencing like really problematic bleeding experiences where they might bleed. I've had, a number of clients who all of a sudden start bleeding for weeks on end, and it's like really a lot of blood. So I'll get back to that. So the pain is independent of age. So all the things that I just said about the pain, if you really spent, like, think about it as a project and put yourself on a spectrum, like think about the woman who's had like just can barely get out of bed for a couple of days and maybe vomit sometimes. I mean, I'm not trying to say that your pain isn't like, I'll try to talk myself out of what I'm trying to say here. So I just want us to think about the 10 as like where the 10 is and where the 0 is. So, but by no means am I saying that your pain is not valid, because I told you that I felt like someone was reaching in my butt, right, and squeezing, and it was really, really, it was very painful. And I had the tendency to say, oh, well, I wasn't vomiting. So we don't want to do that. You know what I mean? But the reason I'm saying that is like, if you think about your pain on the scale and you put yourself somewhere on there, and you decide, okay, I want to really start working to see if I can reduce my pain. If you're like literally at a 10 and it's like really horrific, obviously we shouldn't be expecting that it's going to just go to a 0 in a month. So you would want to think about it like a project and seek support. Like you're going to need support. Like you need to find you get to assemble a good team around you, including people who specifically specialize in that and who've specifically worked with a lot of different clients and had success. You need someone like to guide you. That would be my perspective on it. I'm getting back to the point about the age thing. And then if you're lower on the list, right? So I guess that would be the first thing that I'm saying. If you're in that category where it's really bad, I still don't think just because you get older, it's just automatically going to get worse. Your pain is going to get better or worse depending on what you're doing or not doing. So it's entirely possible that if you decided, okay, this is my project, this is the year, this year I'm going to, research everything I can. I'm going to try to assemble a team. I'm really going to start looking at the different factors that affect pain and all that. And you're going to work on it. And you're not going to think it's going to be better in a month. And if it's not better in a month, I'm going to quit everything. So you're going to actually like take a bit of time and think this through. Think about how many years you've had the pain and maybe, put that into months and maybe make that more of a realistic expectation. And so if you did that, then maybe by the time you hit 41 or whatever, it would actually be amazing. And maybe that would be the time where you actually have the best periods you've ever had. It's possible. But on the other hand, if I just briefly get back to the bleeding, so I shared that I've worked with a number of clients who did have these terrible symptoms, period-related symptoms in the perimenopause phase. However, whenever I was working with these clients and we did like a full assessment of their diet, their activity level, what they're eating, and there was always opportunity for improvement. So as we get older, we have less resilience. And, I'm 42. I've started to experience this for myself. It's really interesting. So when I was in my 20s, yeah, sure, I could have stayed up all night and like gone partying and, not slept really well and like whatever, just got away with it. And it didn't necessarily affect me that much. But a lot of women find out that when they're in their 40s, mid 40s, especially later 40s, you just can't do that stuff. If you don't eat, if you undereat and overexercise, because of course, as you get older, we tend towards a little bit more insulin resistant. So it's easier for us to gain weight. So all of a sudden we're doing the same things we always did, but we're like not as slim as we were. And so then what's the solution? Well, I'm just going to follow these dude influencers and I'm going to stop eating and then I'm going to work out a lot, right? And so
And fast, and make sure you drink
fast,
coffee on an empty stomach.
and coffee, yeah, all the things, right? So sometimes when we're experiencing these horrible period symptoms, like we need to take a step back. And well, of course you are, because you're like doing all these things that again you could have got away with in your 20s, but your body is out. Like I find that as I get older, it's just like it's like a hard no. Have you ever had the experience where you have, like, let's say a family member that's like older, than you, maybe in their 60s or 70s, and you're like, oh, do you want to do this thing, or can we come over? And they're just like a hard no. They're just like, no, we're not doing it. You're just like, what do you, like, in your mind, you're offended because you're just like, what is, but they're just, and they don't care. Have you noticed that? They don't care.
Yes.
That's what your body's like, okay? Your body's like, I don't care. We've done this. I gave you all of your 20s. You didn't sleep. You drank all the coffee. You blah, 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 blah. Now I don't care. So if you want to not follow what I'm doing, you know what? You're just going to bleed for 2 weeks. Like literally. So this is where we can get back to the concept that your menstrual cycle is a vital sign. And it's like, if you don't listen to the whispers, they are going to become yells. So you got to figure this out. Your body is not against you. It's actually for you. That's the hardest part, especially for women who've experienced horrible pain. I think the endo is a little bit different. I think that obviously that's a condition. So I wouldn't say that like that pain is good for you. So let me make that distinction. But I would say your body is for you. And so when you're experiencing symptoms, like not extreme ridiculous, but like when you're experiencing certain symptoms, your body's trying to communicate, and it doesn't have a pager or a cell phone or whatever. It's not texting you. It's giving you these symptoms. And so if you can try to think about it that way and try to think that it's not against you, whatever, then that approach can lead you to more productive solutions.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. And I feel like I really resonate with it because a few months ago, I was really stressing myself out. My husband and I are doing long distance. He's in London. I'm in New York City. It's just very stressful sometimes. And I was able to go see him in London, but I only had a 23-day cycle. It was so short. And I felt like I really stressed myself out. So speaking of fluctuating cycles, what can we expect in perimenopause?
Yeah, for sure. One thing, just to comment on your experience, I mean, it's so interesting. Again, I've spent a really long time working with women with regards to cycles, and I can't tell you how many times it's like, I had this really weird cycle. I don't know what happened. I had an early ovulation or a late ovulation or whatever. I've never had a cycle like this before. And then it's like, well, what was going on that month? And without fail, there's usually something, and so that's something where, again, tracking and paying attention to what's going on and understanding that we're not robots. So there will be fluctuations. So that's probably less. I mean, it could be related to the fact that you're a little bit, in that perimenopause, like you said, because now you're more sensitive to it. But the same thing could have happened when you were younger too, just because of the disturbance. So there's a difference, though, between those disturbances that are more situational and happening as a result of something that literally took place this cycle versus the general changes that can happen over time. So what you can expect as you get into those years leading up to menopause, what the research tells us is that cycles tend toward a little bit shorter as we move into that 10 years, before your last period. So the definition of menopause is your last period. So like menarche, someone in my comments was like, it's menarche. You're saying it wrong. I don't know. Whatever you like. Menarche or menarche. I used to say menarche actually, and then I started saying menarche. Anyway, so menarche is your first period, and then menopause is your last period. And so the average age of menopause is about 51. And so, the 10 years leading up to that, of course, some women would have it later and, but, we can think about the 40s for a lot of us as just generally the time that we're starting to move into that. So, while the average menstrual cycle is about 29 days, as we move into that 10 years before menopause, especially in the first half of that, the average cycle length can start creeping up a little bit. So closer to 26 days. So what that means, and it's interesting because it's not like it's so orderly. It's not like, okay, so last year my cycles were 29 days and this year they were 28 days and next year they're going to be 27, right? It's not like that. But if you track your cycles and you track, let's say, a year of cycles, what I would say is that because that's what's normal in my brain because I've been tracking for so long, right? So what you would typically start to see is as you get older, you're going to start to see like those random shorter ones. So like you never had a 26-day cycle before. You never had a 25-day cycle before. All of a sudden there's one. And you're like, wow. So, and then as you get closer, you might end up having a couple more. You start to notice that every so often you start to maybe have shorter cycles. And if you're tracking what's going on, between periods, you might start to notice the occasional earlier ovulation. So instead of ovulating on day 16 or 17, maybe now you're ovulating on day 15 or 14. Maybe you're ovulating occasionally on day 13. Maybe you have that 12-day ovulation on, so you ovulate on day 12 and you're like, wow, I never ovulate this early. But that's what you can kind of start to expect. Of course, that has implications for, conception and birth control alike. If someone's trying to conceive and they're really stuck in the day 14 situation where they're always having sex on day 14, regardless of what's going on with their mucus, then that could actually be a thing that could prevent you from getting pregnant if you are in that age category and you're trying to conceive and you're not really aware that you could be ovulating earlier than that, and you have it in your mind like, oh, I never ovulate that early, that kind of thing. So, that's kind of what I would say more like you start to notice that you occasionally, and then maybe a little bit more occasionally have the shorter cycles, and that maybe you less frequently have some of the longer ones. So as we move into like the 4, 3, 2-year period before your last one, so now we're closer to like, let's say on average 51. So then you might start to notice the longer cycle lengths. So, but it's not that like, I suppose it's possible that some women just have like, regular cycles until their last one. I don't think that that's the experience of most women. And when we look at the cycle data, especially the between like the last 4 years, especially the last 2 years, like the 2 years before your last period, that's when we start to see more of an increase in the duration of time between periods. And if you've spoken to women who have gone through the transition, they'll start to say that, oh, it was like, I wasn't sure, is this going to be my last one? Is this going to be my last one? Because maybe you have a period and then you go like 2 months without one. And then maybe you have a period and you go like 3 months without one, or 4 months without one, or 5 months without one. And eventually they stop.
So much to look forward to.
Well, we could have a whole conversation on that because obviously our culture does not look positively at all on this phase of menopause. But I've had the good fortune of speaking with so many women who are really connected to their cycles in the space. And, here's one way to think about it that I love talking about because it's not one that you hear a lot. When you're in your reproductive years. So I definitely am. I mean, I have a 2.5-year-old. She's going to be 3 in a month. So up until a few months ago, I was still breastfeeding. I also have a 12-year-old and a 9 and almost 10-year-old. So,
Okay.
but these years, I mean, your body is literally making human beings. If you breastfeed, like I was like on demand. I mean, frankly, like, it's like, what did you do last night? Well, I made food for my child in my sleep. What did you do? Right. But like, it's this period of giving. We're giving our bodies, we're giving our time, our energy. And we just spent a whole lot of time talking about some of the difficulties that can arise with periods. So one of my colleagues, Laura Owen, she calls it reproductive labor. And she's written a lot about this topic. And I remember I went to a lecture where she talked about this concept of reproductive labor and like the unpaid work of menstruation. Think about all the sick days, think about all the products, think about the time and energy that we have to put into menstruating. And I'm not saying it's negative. I have shifted my mindset around it, but it is something to think about, right? But when you reach menopause, again, assuming that you have some cycle awareness and that you're able to, it doesn't have to be this horrible, horrible thing. So I think that we're in an interesting time. I'm watching all of these influencers who were previously all about natural, like, no, don't take the pill. All of them are like, everyone needs to take HRT, all of you. And it's like, now we're kind of being expected, like we're going into this perimenopause, expecting it to be horrible, expecting it to be awful, expecting your periods to get so much worse, expecting to gain all this weight and to just not be able to sleep. And we're kind of expecting it to be, it's like a medical condition. That's how they're talking about it. I don't think it has to be that way. And I feel like I'm going to have a lot more to say after I go through it myself. And I think I'm going to have a lot to share about that, at that time. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it has to be that way. I still think the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, even in perimenopause. And I think that if it's horrible, it probably means that there's some things that we need to look at. And if we can sort out a lot of our, lifestyle factors and foundational factors, that we probably wouldn't need as much of it. I don't think it's supposed to just be horrible. I don't think everything's supposed to be terrible. But with all of that said, when you hit that stage where your body stops cycling, you get to keep that energy now. You are no longer giving it away. It is yours. And that is why all those women in their 60s and 70s are like, no, I'm not doing it, because they are like, it's like they're done. It's amazing. Have you noticed the energy of women who've passed it?
They have no F's left to give.
None. All of the F's have been distributed and they have none left whatsoever. I am so looking forward. So let me be on record as like the one woman I don't want it to happen too early. I'm happy to keep menstruating as long as I'm supposed to. I want to keep having that, all of my lovely hormones until it's time for them to dwindle. But with that said, when they dwindle and it is my time, you just wait.
I love it. I love this energy and the enthusiasm behind it. I did want to go back to, speaking of F's and how sperm can live in the body for 5 days. I did have someone ask, what's the ideal number of days a man should build up his sperm before trying to get his partner pregnant?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's a couple different ways I can answer this question. I think that ultimately, so if he's healthy and his sperm count and concentration is normal, then there would be no need for him to specifically do any special measures. So that's something to think about. It's not like we all have to do these somersaults and dances to get pregnant. If we think about, if you're healthy reproduction, periods healthy, cycles healthy, it really shouldn't be like a big problem. So with that said, though, obviously there is a growing number of men with limited sperm counts, and there is a big problem with just that whole conversation. We wrote a really intense chapter on sperm quality in Real Food for Fertility because I almost wrote a book on it. Like I actually had the cover, like I was going to write a book on it. So we have a really intense chapter on sperm. So I suppose, my best information that I could share would be, don't get too hung up on that. I would say some people like to kind of do the every other day strategy, or, maybe 2 to 3 days. I just wouldn't go too crazy. But if you are concerned about his potential contribution, if he's willing to take a test, I would say that would be optimal. It would be better to actually have him get his sperm tested, because if then you know what you're working with. And I would, what I found is a lot of my clients whose partners get the sperm test, the practitioners don't always go through it in a lot of details. We have this really detailed chapter. We go through what's optimal, what's normal, so you could compare the test to what we talk about in there, know where he stands. That gives you, I think the worst part about not being tested if you're trying to conceive and it's not happening right away. And, a lot of people would get that test like, a year in or something. And if you want to try to improve his sperm, it can happen, depending on the reason, as long as it's not like an actual physical like problem. There's a lot of opportunity to improve sperm quality, but of course it's not overnight. It takes a minimum of 3 to 6 months, because the sperm he is ejaculating today is a direct result of what he was doing 3 months ago. So there's a bit of a leg, similar to if we wanted to improve our egg quality, we need that kind of 3 month, because that's how long it takes from the kind of beginning of that process of spermatogenesis and oogenesis.
Okay, thank you. I could talk to you for hours and hours. And this next question I have, this is what I'm going to have you back on, because we need at least an hour to talk about the pill, because we didn't even really touch on contraceptives. But there was another question that before this woman gets her period, she gets migraines and she does have a hormonal IUD. And she's wondering, Is that normal, or what can she do to mitigate it?
Well, I mean, I answer questions with questions a lot of the time. So, I would be curious as to whether she got these migraines before she had the IUD or if they started when she got it. Because sometimes I have these conversations with clients. And again, like it's easier from the outside living in. When you're living in your body, it is really hard to piece this stuff together, which is why we need support. Anyways, so I can't tell you how many times where it's like, so when did they start? And it's like, well, I didn't really have them until the fall. When did you have your ID put in? Well, that was put in September. Okay, so right. So if it's related to that, I mean, that's a complicated question because it doesn't mean run out and get your IUD out. Like she put it in for a reason, But if it's related to that, then that's something, you can try to have a conversation with your practitioner. It's a hard one. We talked about that in this conversation because especially IUDs, often they're not excited to take them out. They want them in. So sometimes I've had, clients have to go to multiple practitioners just to get it out. Or some practitioners just tell them, no, I'm not taking it out. Like, it's just like, what is happening? And then if it's not really related to the IUD and it's happening before her period, I mean, that could be obviously a hormonal situation. Now, when you're on the hormonal IUD, you could still try different strategies to support progesterone, work on those foundational factors. I think when you have a hormone releasing device in your body, it is hard to balance hormones but you can do everything you can to try to, to try to do it naturally to support your body, to make sure you're eating enough, look at your exercise routine, look at your sleep habits, maybe just take extra care of yourself during that time before your period. If you're doing some really significant, whatever it is that you're doing, if your life is super hectic, you're doing lots of hard work the week before your cycle, maybe even just trying to rest. That's probably the best I can say.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I'm so excited for my community to listen to this. I do have one more question before we wrap this up. You are such a wealth of knowledge, and I know that you teach practitioners a bit of your knowledge, maybe as much as you can. Where can we find practitioners who have taken your course?
Well, thank you for that. That's a great question. So on my website, we have a practitioner directory, so fertilityfriday.com. And I mean, like you said, I've been teaching practitioners. I've shifted in recent years. There's a lot of different reasons for that. I think when I first started this, when I first started Fertility Friday and I wrote the book, I mean, ever since I learned about charting, I knew that it was such a big issue and I wanted to be part of that solution. And I think now that I've been working with clients for so many years, maybe I'm seeing how big of a challenge it is. Like, I feel like it's a David and Goliath situation. How are a bunch of, women going to take on the pharmaceutical companies that kind of, that's the pharmaceutical companies are related to the medical system, and all of these things are not looking for natural alternatives for, menstrual issues and things like that. So that's part of the reason that I've shifted my focus to work with practitioners, because the reach potential is so much greater. For every practitioner that works for me, they can go on to have a full career working with so many different clients and really bringing this knowledge to different audiences. So I feel like, who gave me a megaphone, right? Like, I just want women to understand. It doesn't mean I think every woman should be using fertility awareness actively as their birth control. We all have those decisions to make for what's going to be best for us, but we should all know everything that we talked about today. Shouldn't women know all that stuff?
I didn't learn it till my mid-30s.
That's what I'm saying.
Wouldn't this have been so helpful to learn if you were 15, 16, or have your mom talk to you about your first period and what could be in your underwear and so many things, Lisa?
Yeah, there's a lot of, yeah. And so I was very fortunate because I did discover this at a really young age. I was charting my cycles already at 19, and I was, teaching women when I was in my early 20s, because looking back, I know it was meant to be, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Right. And I can't take that for granted, which is why I won't stop talking about it. But yeah, life would be so different. But, for anyone who's interested, we have a lot of fun things going on. I just created a brand new resource and guide for women's health practitioners. It's the Practitioner's Guide to Optimizing Egg Quality. So fertilityfriday.com/egg quality. And you can grab a hold of that. And yeah, I would say if you liked our conversation today, I have been podcasting for 11 years. We have almost 600 episodes, which can be a little overwhelming, but head over to, fertilityfriday.com or just search Fertility Friday in your favorite podcast player. Strangely, there is now another Fertility Friday podcast. It's irritating, but mine is the pink one. So whether you like pink or not, just look for the pink one. That is me.
Amazing. Who else came up with that name? You're the OG.
Well, I mean, it's been a long time now, so I feel like maybe, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not even that upset. I'm just like, really?
Flattery.
You could
right?
have done a little search, but whatever. And then search for me at Fertility Friday on Instagram. I'm always posting fun stuff over there, so you can find me there.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, now, as we wrap up this conversation, I ask all my guests the same closing question, which is, what haven't I asked you that you'd like my listeners to know?
That's a good question. I feel like we covered a lot of ground. We could have a whole podcast on PCOS only, or egg quality, or like you said, birth control. That's a whole hour and a half discussion. So, I mean, I think we did pretty well. And if I wanted to leave the listeners to kind of sum up what we talked about, I would just say, learn about your body. If this resonated with you today, I'm really glad that you're here. And I don't believe in coincidences, so I think you were supposed to hear it. It does not resonate with everybody. So it's not like everybody hears this menstrual cycle stuff and is like, oh my goodness, I need to start charting my cycles immediately. Like, there's a lot of women that are like, absolutely not. This is not what I'm interested in. I don't want to chart anything. You want me to what with my mucus? You want to touch what? So if you are having that like wow moment, do something about it. Start somewhere, because I mean it. Like, you think everyone needs to know this and everyone's going to be as excited as you? Absolutely not.
The 1%ers are. They're out there.
It's funny though, because I went through all of this. Like, I was making books. All of my friends know how to chart. The thing about it is you can't force people to do it. There were plenty of people who heard the same information as me and they were not excited. They were just like, I'm going to stay on the pill. Leave me alone. And that's fine. That's fine though. It's fine, because everybody isn't the same. And that's okay. That's what makes the world interesting. So definitely, if this is resonating with you, go with that and lean into it and learn about it. There's a reason.
I love it. Oh, I love that parting wisdom. I can't wait to have you back on the show. I know you mentioned your website, your podcast, your Instagram, but tell listeners one more time where they can go to find out more about you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, fertilityfriday.com. I should mention the books. So, Real Food for Fertility. I co-authored that book with Lily Nichols. I'm working with women trying to support them to improve their cycles. And they're asking me what are my nutritional recommendations for optimizing the cycle, balancing hormones? And I would say, okay, well, read Real Food for Pregnancy, but just ignore the pregnancy part until you're pregnant, right? Like, this book contains those fundamental tenets of nutrition that you would need to optimize your cycle, because ultimately, when your cycle is healthy, you should be able to get pregnant easily, even if that's not what you want. If you're not trying to get pregnant, like, it's still better to have a healthy cycle, right? So,
Yes.
realfoodforfertility.com, you will find the first chapter for free if you want to do that. And then it's available on Amazon. So, and the fifth vital sign is also a bit like the fifth vital sign is more of a deep dive into the charting, the mucus. If the word mucus doesn't weird you out, or if it does, and you're like, you know what, I want to overcome this. I have a whole chapter on cervical mucus in the fifth vital sign, and it is unreal.
Lisa, it has been such a pleasure. I can't wait to have you back on. We have so much to talk about. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is a labor of love, and I'm dedicated to providing free content for years to come. If an episode has brought you joy, clarity, or valuable insights, your support means so much to me. A quick shout out on Instagram or sharing this podcast with a friend can make a big difference. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, a great way to help support the show, or even on YouTube, is by leaving a review. You can also help support my work by using any of the affiliate links that I leave in my detailed show notes, or visit my website, ashleydaily.com. I'm most active on Instagram if you're looking for me, so you can find me at Ashley_Daily. Thank you for helping me keep this podcast alive. This podcast is presented for educational and exploratory purposes only. Published content is not intended to be used for diagnosing or treating any illnesses, disease, or disorders. Those responsible for this show disclaim any responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of this information presented by myself or my guests. Please consult with your healthcare provider before using any products or services referenced in this podcast. This podcast may contain paid endorsements for products or services. Any third-party materials or content of any third-party site referenced on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions or standards of the policy of my guests. This podcast and my website, ashleydeely.com, represent the opinions of myself. The content discussed on the show should not and does not replace medical advice. The content here is for informational purposes only. Episodes on Welcome to Wellness may at times cover sensitive topics, including but not limited to depression, suicide, COVID-19, vaccines, events related to the pandemic, 5G, big pharma, nootropics, circumcision, psychedelics, hormones, the Women's Health Initiative, the use of plant medicine, abortion, geoengineering, terrorism, gender, AI, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You are advised to refrain from listening to this podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. However, if these topics interest you, you just may have found your tribe. The information or opinions expressed on the Welcome to Wellness show are solely the views of the individuals involved and by no means represent absolute facts, opinions, or expressed by the host, and guests can change at any time. The views of my guests are solely their views, and the Welcome to Wellness show does not accept responsibility for them, and any action you take on the information contained within this show is strictly at your own risk. The Welcome to Wellness host, Ashley Deely, will not be liable for any losses or damages in connections with the use of this podcast. You should take all necessary steps to ascertain the information you receive from this podcast is correct and has been verified. None of the guests or the contributors on the Welcome to Wellness podcast will be responsible for your use of the information contained therewithin. Under no circumstances will the Welcome to Wellness show or my affiliate partners, suppliers, licenses, or guests appearing on the show be liable for any direct or indirect consequential damages arising from your inability to access this podcast. All intellectual property rights belong to me, Ashley Deely, and are included but not limited to the copyright and any other rights in the design. You are permitted to the Welcome to Wellness podcast for personal use, but not for commercial use without license. You may not make recordings of or otherwise copy this podcast. If you breach these terms, you lose the right to access the Welcome to Wellness podcast, and you must destroy or return any copies of the recordings you've made. Guests on the Welcome to Wellness podcast may at times provide information on or read extracts from third-party copyrighted work. The Welcome to Wellness podcast does not provide any medical or professional advice within these episodes. If you take any action or inaction as a result from the content you consume from within the Welcome to Wellness podcast, this is based solely on your decision, and the Welcome to Wellness podcast and Ashley Deely and my guests cannot be held responsible or liable for any of the consequences on such action or inaction. Thank you.